What's going on, guys? This is Tyler back with another video here with SHORTSLABS, and today we're going to be talking about market saturation. The dreaded market saturation. Yes, I talked about it in episode 61 or 62, whichever video that was recently, that really highlights the fact that grading is not going to save the market for our oversaturated cards, really starting in 2018. In the previous video, I walked through the 80s and 90s market collapse, and then I talked about a couple blue chip investments from the 90s and early 2000s that really bucked the trend. And they bucked the trend because quantity was very, very low. PSA graded cards, Beckett graded cards saved the 80s and 90s, early 90s from the saturation that we all experienced. In the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, really not that big of a deal really not that big of a deal whenever it comes to the oversupply. However, graded cards were still relatively rare. Starting in 2018, however, that's just not the case. There are a lot of graded cards hitting the market, and it's very unprecedented for us to really be approaching population reports over 10,000. So I actually posted this recently on Blowout Cards and the Luka Doncic thread, and this is right around early September. I'm really just revisiting this because I think that I explained it a little bit better here, and I wanted to pull this up. So I made the comment here, Topps flag, well, not that one. I made the comment, isn't that something? There are more PSA 10 Luka Prism rookies than PSA 10 89 Topps traded Griffey Jr. rookies. And just for the population reports, I have those pulled up here just to show you guys the difference in the PSA 10 Luka versus the PSA 10 Topps traded Griffey. Obviously, this is going to trigger a lot of people who are currently buying PSA 10 Luka Prism rookies. Right or wrong. I don't mean to be offensive, and I'm not saying that that's a bad buy. I'm not saying that the market is just going to collapse. I'm not saying that whatsoever. But what I am saying is that this is very, very unprecedented, and that if I were investing, meaning that I have an intent to make money, then I would not be putting my money in a Luka Prism PSA 10. So we have a couple comments here. One person says, I don't doubt that Luka's Prism has a super high print run, but comparing a card from 1989 when nobody was grading, most probably sent in decades later after wear and tear, isn't really a good comparison, right? And that's a very, very fair point. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of wear and tear. However, there's a lot more to it than just that. And here I describe a little bit more why. So I say it doesn't necessarily need to be a perfect comparison for the point to be made. Yes, there are probably 1,089 Topps traded Griffies. There are probably 50 to 100,000 Luka Prism base. So big difference in total overall supply. Although that 50 to 100,000 Luka Prism base is vastly different than what we're used to for the past 2 decades. Couple of points. There are more Luka Prism PSA 10s than Griffey Topps traded PSA 10s, despite the Griffey being on the market 29 years longer. It's a big difference to me. Irregardless of how the Griffies survived, the simple fact that we have exceeded junk-era pop reports should be alarming to anyone holding a Prism base. And I put base on there as bass. It's just one of the things on the forum. We call it base because it's base. It's big. A lot of base. All right, there's a reason why this title, little old startup called Upper Deck, rocked the world in '89, and the Griffey card, and was the Griffey card to get. It was not the flagship Topps baseball card, which at the time had been the go-to card for nearly 4 decades. No, Upper Deck stole the baseball card market because of rarity, and to a slight extent, the premium card stock. Obviously, it was a lot better than any card stock that we had seen up to that point. Second, between 1996 and 2017, I've yet to find another comparator card that currently sells for greater than $1,000 that has a population report greater than 10,000. Now, granted, I'm focusing only on PSA 10s. I didn't look at the SP Jeter to see, as a PSA 8 or PSA 7. I don't even know if PSA 7s are over $1,000. They may be now. Those may actually be exceptions to that rule, but really focusing on PSA 10s, and obviously that doesn't fit my criteria of 1996 to 2017. The point is, it is very rare for a PSA 10 or a Beckett 9.5 or SGC whatever to sell for 4 figures and have that large of a population report. It's just something we've never done. If you look at my previous video, I pointed out some of the most modern, epic blue chip investment cards that from a basketball and baseball perspective, not really even touching on football, which football's population reports are even lower whenever you look at your Tom Brady's, your Peyton Manning's. Even the Patrick Mahomes Prism card will likely never exceed 2,000 copies just because of the issue that it had from a printing production standpoint. It just doesn't happen. So from an investment perspective, why would I want to buy something that has almost 15,000 PSA 10s that's trading? At the time of this, these guys were trading around 1,500. They had been 2,000. Now they're around 1,200. So, third point. Those arguing not to forget the demand side right now are correct. Remember, demand for 1987, 1993 cards was strong at one point in time, outweighing the millions and millions of printing copies of each card. 100% true. The overall supply was far exceeded by the demand, and you have to look at overall supply, and then you have to look at the available supply, which I don't know. There's probably an economic term for it. I'll call it relative supply. The relative supply meaning not all 3 million or 2 million of those cards are made available to the market at any given time, right? You can't buy, on a stock market, all the available shares that are in the world. These cards are printed. Some are put in personal collection. Some are still in packs. Some are in grandma's attic, never to be seen. Some are thrown out because they're garbage. Some are burned because they're really not worth more than firewood in many cases. There's a lot of things that happen to these cards, and not every single one of them are available at the same time, right? So that's just one thing to keep in mind. You have the overall supply, but then you have the relative supply of what is currently available on the market. So my point here is, what happens when the market turns? This is much easier to explain audibly, which I'm now doing now, but I'm doing the voiceover of this. So hopefully we can gel both of those two things together and the point is driven home a little bit more clearly. But let's say that you have a demand curve that looks like this. And I have the demand curve written out, but graphically just visualize an X and a Y axis. Let's say that you had a buyer pool for this card, and nobody knows what the buyer pool is. Nobody knows what a true supply and demand curve is. The market is the market, but nobody knows what the true market is for these pricing brackets that I'm talking about here. So let's say that you have 10,000 buyers of a Luca Prism 10 at $500. What I mean by that is, let's say that if the price all of a sudden crashed to $500, there were 10,000 buyers. And for the simplicity terms, let's not say 10,000 buyers. Let's say buyers are willing to buy 10,000 copies at $500 for simplicity's sake. And then let's say that there's 5,000 buyers or 5,000 copies that will be bought at $750. If the price is at $1,000, that drops to 2,500 buyers. If the price is $1,250, let's say that that shrinks the pool to 500 buyers. If there's 1,500, if the price goes to 1,500, that limits the pool to 100 buyers. And then at 1,750, let's say that there's only 10 buyers or 10 copies that will sell based on the relative supply and also the relative demand of that market point. And then at 2,000, there's no buyers. So let's say that you have that demand curve, and that's what that looks like. What happens when the market turns? Okay, so currently there are 13,000 of these cards in circulation. I think whenever I did this video, there were 13,000, but we're getting close to 14 or 15,000 now. If the demand for each bracket suddenly is cut by 50%, meaning this buyer pool, instead of it being 10,000 buyers at 500, it's 5,000 buyers at 500. What happens then? Let's see, where am I? If it's cut by 50%, 75%, or 80%, wouldn't it make much more sense to be holding a card that is much more rare, where fluctuations in this demand curve have an inelastic effect on price? Now, what do I mean by that? An inelastic effect on price, meaning that even if you shrink the demand curve, you cut it in half, you cut it substantially, because the card is so rare and the relative supply is so limited, there's still going to be a large enough number of buyers to outweigh the relative supply. Obviously, that is much easier whenever the supply side of the curve is very small, right? If you have 15,000 PSA 10s or 13,000 PSA 10s, whatever the number is, which is unprecedented, sure, that demand is being met right now because Luka is widely reviewed as the best player in the NBA. What if the pandemic all of a sudden just continues to go for the next 2 to 3 years and people are like, cards, really not that much into it. I don't want something that, I got to buy food and I got to buy, all these things to survive. The buyer pool shrinks dramatically. What happens if Luka has an injury? What happens if, 3 to 4 years into his career, he doesn't make it to, the Western Conference Finals? He doesn't live up to who we think we are or think that he is. What if there's just an economic downturn, not pandemic related, that is very similar to what happened in 2008, 2009, or 2007, 2008, that really shrinks the entire demand curve for cards? Not every single card crashed in 2007, 2008, but the ones that were relatively not rare, they did crash. But I'm going to give you an example, and I talk about this a little bit later on down the line, of how you can protect yourself. So again, that inelastic effect on demand is extremely, extremely important, or inelastic effect on price is extremely important, because that's the built-in protection that you want as an investor, so that all these cards, if something suddenly goes awry, if there's a major injury, if people all of a sudden want to cash out because every single seller is losing faith, or every single holder of these cards loses faith in their player, and they all dump at the same time on the market, that relative supply now greatly exceeds demand, and you're going to see wide fluctuations in prices. It is very simple microeconomics. Very simple microeconomics. So, fourth point, as the previous poster mentioned, folks should stop comparing Prism from year 1 to Prism year 2 to Prism year 8. Every year has a different supply-demand curve, not even factoring in the variance in demand for each player, but mainly factoring in supply. So what I mean by that is people who are saying, well, Giannis PSA 10 rookies got up to $7,000, which are now trading at $3,000 to $3,500 after he exited the playoffs. It's literally a 100% drop, which to me is just crazy. So that means that Luka should be at $7,000, right? Because they're like competing for the best young stars in the NBA. Wrong. Wrong. The reason why that is wrong is mainly because of supply. So not even factoring in the overall demand for the player, that demand being variable between each player, meaning that LeBron James's demand is different than Steph Curry, which is different than Mike Trout, which is a baseball player, which is different than every other Prism player out there, right? The demand is just different based on the player. But what most people are not factoring in whenever I see these on message boards or I see people comment about this is the supply. You cannot compare a Giannis PSA Prism 10 rookie that has roughly 2,000 copies made to a Luka card that has 7 times the number of PSA 10s. And granted, the Giannis card has been out on the market for 6 to 7 years. The Luka has been on the market for roughly a year and a half, almost 2 years. Big difference. Big difference. So I go on to this a little bit. So I give an analogy here. So this is an analogy of like good economy, bad economy, and a good investment type card that people should be buying. Again, if you want to collect whatever you want. If you want a Prism PSA 10 Luka, get one. It would be great to have one. I have one. I just happen to have one that is rare, and that's the Fast Break Prism. The population on that card is very, very low, meaning that if something ever happened, there's only so many of those cards out there. It's not a base card that is overprinted, oversupplied. That's why the Tiffany cards from the 80s are so popular. The glossy cards are so popular. All those are very, very limited. We're talking about tops traded Tiffany cards that have a population report or a production number of around 5,000 to 10,000 depending on the year. Some I think are around 15,000. Vastly different than the millions and millions that were printed for the regular card, right? So obviously high grade copies of this are going to be very, very rare, or at least relatively rare compared to demand. So here's an example that I give. This is why the high-end art, high-end sports cards, and high-end anything really survives an economic downturn, and why many rare and desirable sports cards did very well in 2008. When the couple of the cards that I'm thinking of are really high grade vintage cards, or even high grade Jordan rookies, autographs and patches of Jordan, or very, very those blue chip rare investments like a PSA 9 or PSA 10, SPG to rookie. Obviously, there's going to be in such high demand where it doesn't matter if the economy goes down. The people who are going to be in that market are not going to be impacted by a downturn in the economy anyway. So, but there's other examples that really fit every single price bracket. So I give an example. Take Mike Trout's 2009 Bowman Chrome Draft autographed rookie card, for example. Yes, it's made in 2008, but I'm using it as an example. I was giving the example of the economic downturn in 2007, 2008, but that extended all the way through to 2013. So the overall production number for this card is around 2,000 to 2,500 copies for the base card. So there's around 2,000 of those made, and I'm not even factoring in the grading piece. So I give an example here. So let's say, actually I think that I'm using PSA 10s. So let's say in a good economy and a bad economy, I'm doing a price comparison here. So in a good economy, let's say $5,000, there's 10,000 buyers, or 10,000 copies that will sell. 7,500, there's 7,500 copies that will sell. Price of 10,000 has 5,000 buyers. Price of 15,000 has 2,500 buyers. Yada yada yada. You get the idea. Eventually, we get to the point where at $40,000, there's still 5 buyers. And yes, these prices are totally made up. The card is not worth that much. It's a $16,000 card. Think of this as a parallel, the refractor, X-fractor, or whatever. So in a bad economy, let's say that all of a sudden the demand curve gets cut by about 50% for each bracket. So let's say that there's now 5,000 buyers of this trout now instead of 10,000 at the $5,000 price point. We scroll down here to the $20,000 price point, and instead of there being 1,000 buyers, there's now 500. The point is that once we get all the way down here to some of these higher brackets, 250 buyers down to 125, 100 buyers down to, you could even say 50. I don't know why I didn't cut that in half. 5 buyers down to 2. These cards never come available to market. So if Mike Trout gets hurt, they're not dumping this card. Collectors and holders of this card are not dumping them. And even if they did dump them, it's probably 1 or 2 people who are getting really cold feet in holding this card. Unlike people who are holding Ronald Acuna Jr. update rookies. Whenever he goes into a slump, a lot of those hit the market and they're given away. Or whenever a big player goes into a slump or gets injured, and a lot of those cards hit the market and people are just getting rid of them. Now, not a lot. Oftentimes you'll see a lot of the big cards, people are like, oh, this is a bad time to sell. I'm going to weather out the storm. But a lot of these big high-end production cards like Topps Update cards, Prism-based rookies, all those will just get flooded on the market. I mean, right now you are seeing so many Prism graded Luka cards, whether it's PSA 10, PSA 9. I mean, the market is just flooded with these cards. There's so many of them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are not believers. I think a lot of people are probably cashing in right now because the prices have gone up so much and people are getting them back from the grading companies. But again, what happens if something bad happens to Luka and people say, I want to get out of this? Or they just get cold feet. You're now going to be competing with potentially 15,000 other people, but obviously, as I just stated, not all those are going to hit the market at one time. But it's going to be a lot more than this. I mean, I showed you all the population report numbers for this Bowman Chrome Mike Trout, but let's just bring that up again, and I'll show you. There is just not a lot of these out there. And what people should be doing is, yes, buy this card. I don't have one, but I would love to have one. I used to have a lot of them, but not anymore. Buy cards like this. Now, no, I'm not saying go out and buy a $16,000 PSA 10. What I'm saying is buy cards that are rare. Rarity survives, and rarity becomes very much so in high demand over time. Yes, people want Prism, and yes, people want shiny, but that will not always be the case. People who have jumped into this hobby over the past couple of years who want this just strictly from a flipping and investing perspective, they will not be here forever. and they are very, very uneducated. They have no idea what they are doing. So right now the market is being controlled by a bunch of people who have no idea how this market works, and the only thing that they see is prism. The only thing they see is optic. So right now the demand is artificially, I mean, it's real demand. I can't say it's artificial. The demand is very high. But once these people become developing some type of savviness to their investor methods, because you can collect whatever you want. You can't say that people are savvy collectors. Collectors are collectors, right? Once they're very savvy flippers or savvy investors, they're not going to be buying a card that has a population report of 15,000. They're just not. Or at least not expecting it to go to 5,000 or 4,000. Like, if they may anticipate this card going from 1,200 to 1,600, okay, but that's just a 25 to 33% gain. You could have done much better with that $1,200 and invested it in a different Luca card that has a low production number, low population report. Even a second year Luca would probably outperform the base because there's just so many of them. And whenever there's so many of them, it's so hard to move the needle and have that demand go up. But it is very easy for that demand to disappear and prices just inevitably crash. So that is my take on this. Hopefully everybody here got the entire picture. I did not necessarily mean to create a stir. I think a lot of people really kind of agreed with this, which is good. This guy didn't necessarily agree, which is okay. Not everybody's going to agree, but that's my take. You can do strategies however you want. Obviously, this Luca Prism wave is a wave that you can ride. It has really lost about 35 to 40% of its value, but that is not because of what I'm saying right now. That's just the natural cyclical nature of getting kicked out of the playoffs. Giannis values dropped 40% last year after he got kicked out of the playoffs. This year it looks like they're dropping, depending on the card, the Prism value has dropped the most. The other rookies haven't dropped as much as the Prism rookie, but we're still seeing drops in people who are really now out of sight, out of mind. It happens every single year. So I may do another video on that in terms of off-season cycles or just cycles in general. But let me know what your all's thoughts are with this. If this is something that you all understand, you disagree with, if you think demand right now is just far outweighing the supply, which I think it currently is, and if you think that that's going to continue, just let me know what your thoughts are. I love to hear what other people's thoughts are, especially if you have a very well articulated response that you can really share with me, especially in terms of disagreement, because I certainly want to hear other people's thoughts on this. So I feel like I'm spitting everywhere. I've got this Gatorade and it's really not quenching my thirst because I'm spitting like sand. All right, guys. Hope you liked the video. As always, drop a like, drop a subscription, because I don't think anybody else is dropping content like this out there. At least I don't think so. If they are, point them my way, because I also want to soak up knowledge like a sponge as well. So hope you guys have a good rest of the week. Thanks.